Good evening, everyone. Thank you so very much for being with us this evening. My name is Kristen McMahon, and I am the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center. I would like to thank a few members of my board who are here tonight. I am fortunate to have a very supportive board. So with us this evening are Greg Peterson, Peggy Morgan, Art Bailey, John Jackson, and Steve Cass. So thank you all very much for supporting us tonight. So when we first started discussing the program for tonight, I don't think we realized just how timely and topical it would really end up being. Let me introduce Dr. Brian Harward. He is the Robert G. Sedig Chair in Political Science and the director of the Center for Political Participation at Allegheny College. He has researched and published numerous articles and books on political philosophy, law and legal ethics, American politics, including congressional oversight, and perhaps most importantly for us this evening, executive power. He recently published a book called, although we learned this was not its original title, The Presidency in Times of Crisis and Disaster. And that is what he will be speaking on tonight. More importantly, presidential power in the modern era. If you would all please join me in welcoming Dr. Brian Harward.
Thank you, Kristen. So is this too loud? Is this distorted? Okay. I just wanted to say just how pleased I am to be here and to see so many friends of the Jackson Center. Students, of course, I'm pleased that they made the trip with me from Allegheny. Friends and alumni of Allegheny College, it's good to see you as well. And also, it's nice to make some new friends, of course, and so that's been fun for me. I would like to thank, though, in particular, Kristen, Greg, Marion, and all the staff of the Jackson Center, because for many years they have welcomed Allegheny students to their programs and hosted students as interns or researchers in their offices. And in doing that, they've mentored them. And they've shared with them their own excitement and curiosity about law, history, politics, public service, and so much more. Our students are drawn to the center, of course, by Jackson and his legal legacy, but I think the real value of the experience for almost every one of our students is the personal interaction and meaningful connections that they make with each of you who works there. I think that what you do at the center is important, and the contributions you make to the richness of our civic life in this region and around the world is remarkable. So thanks to each of you. And I'm delighted to be here to speak tonight. To be asked to do so is quite an honor. And it's nice to think that a political scientist might be called upon from time to time. But as you imagine, few people care about what political scientists have to say about anything until something breaks. And until something so challenges what we thought we knew about how politics works, that an overview of some kind might actually be useful or even cathartic to those of us who are trying to make sense of recent events. And so how that all that we've observed bears, if at all, on a larger trajectory of presidential power is something that I'd like to talk to you about tonight. But at the same time, as I do so, I want to, along the way, acknowledge and discuss at some length the contributions of Robert H. Jackson to our own understanding of those larger patterns of presidential power. So let me start by offering a brief structure here for my talk. My plan is to start with an overview of constitutionalism and executive power historically, and in times of crisis and disaster, of course, because that's the title of the book, and I feel obligated to attend to that. But really, the story of presidential power is marked by times of crisis and disaster very often. And then move into a specific approach to executive power, known as the unitary executive theory, and some of you may be familiar with that theory. And then ultimately I'll close with ways in which Congress and other institutional actors might, were they so inclined, actually take efforts to constrain executive power. My hope is that I can move pretty quickly so we can have a good conversation at the end about executive power in the contemporary context. So let me start with a rather obvious but I think important idea, that presidential power is not a fixed set of finite, clearly expressed or enumerated powers. Rather, the source of presidential power is ambiguity. In broad language, Article 2 of the Constitution vests the president with the executive power to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Those constitutional provisions are not defined with great precision. In their ambiguity, they admit of many different interpretations, including the authority for a president to pursue actions that are not explicitly granted by the Constitution. The result, as some scholars have argued, is a slow but steady shift of the institutional balance of power in favor of presidents. The president's capacity for taking unilateral action, and thus for making law on his own, defines what is distinctively modern about the modern American presidency. Often, presidents do this through executive orders, and perhaps you've paid attention to some of that. Trump has issued 140 executive orders since he took office, which is actually not that far out of pace with recent presidents. It is a bit more than most others, any others, but it's not exceptionally so. And sometimes they do it through proclamations or national security directives or some other particular unilateral device. But whatever vehicles they choose, the end result is that presidents can and do make law without the explicit consent of Congress. So the ability and the proclivity of presidents to act unilaterally is a defining feature of the contemporary presidency. But that unilateralism cuts both ways, and it presents a bit of a paradox. We seem to be caught in this tension between two beliefs, a belief in executive leadership, efficiency, and swiftness that leadership might bring. But we're also then faced with a fear of unfettered executive power. So, for instance, the energy and dispatch in the executive branch can be a very good thing. The emergence of a national, global economy, industrialization, and the challenges that arose in the industrial era required national solutions to national problems. And sometimes presidents are uniquely situated to solve those problems. Congress sees the value of that and delegates to the president then significant lawmaking authority to those executive branches in order to address those pressing problems. So Congress can't regulate everything across a whole range of complex policy areas, so they shift that over to the presidency. In addition, the New Deal and civil rights eras gave rise to powerful citizens' claims on central governmental power, and the expectation that a president in particular had a very special role in securing citizens' well-being. Also, the 20th century's two world wars concentrated military power in the executive, and the persistent national security challenges of this century consolidate that power ever more. And on top of that, the rise in candidate-centered campaigns creates incentives for presidents to be active, aggressive stewards of executive power. They promise results and grand plans, even when they're likely to be limited in their capacity to deliver on those plans. Watching the primaries, you might have you might be reminded of this. So we tend to expect our presidents to be agenda setters, to be activist presidents, acting with efficiency and swiftness to deal with pressing public issues. But at the same time, we're mindful of the dangers of the imperial presidency, a president unfettered by statutory or constitutional authority or by the so-called guardrails of democracy. The energy and dispatch that we demand of our executives in certain contexts necessarily implicates issues of democratic accountability and control. When a president says, as Trump has said, Article 2 says I can do anything I want. Or when President Nixon says, when a president does it, it means it's not illegal. When we hear those, we are alerted to the limits of presidential powers, even if we struggle to agree on where those limits are. And we similarly struggle as we act to impose constraints. And then we're faced with other confounding questions. That is, what if the president shares my policy preferences? Is my concern about presidential unilateralism situational? Yeah, probably. I think if we're being honest with ourselves, many of us. Is that a bad thing for constitutionalism and for democracy? Also, probably, but not necessarily. And part of my goal tonight is to identify a distinction between policy-level disputes and regime-level threats. Unilateralism plays out in both contexts, but it does so quite differently. And we also want to think about ways to invigorate, among other things, congressional resilience in the face of executive power. So to do that, let's understand the constitutional order in which presidents and Congress operate. And typically when we do this, we step back and I ask my students, are you with me so far? Everybody understand? And they say, yes, but they don't really mean it. When I say that, talk about the constitutional order in which they're operating, I want to think back about the whole project, and constitutionalism, and the rule of law, and limited government, and what it's in the maximizing human potential and human happiness. Right? That's what the whole project is about, and that's where I want to begin our discussion. Because when we think about the rule of law, when we think about constitutionalism, we think about it as binding political authority to a set of formal constraints. In the US, our Constitution constrains the exercise of political power to prevent grave risks to constitutional government. But how exactly does the Constitution constrain political behavior? The constraints that constitutionalism places on public officials are in many important respects conditioned by the willingness of the political order to apply the constraints. Political scientist Keith Whittington argues that there is no perspective external to politics from which to define those constraints. And there is no non-political mechanism available to enforce those constraints. Both our interpretation of constitutional obligation and the maintenance of the constitutional form occur within political practices. Constitutionalism, then, can only be understood in a political context. Constitutional meaning is made and remade through political struggle. This means that challenges to constitutionalism, challenges to the rule of law posed by presidents, for instance, and the means by which we attempt to constrain those actions must be found within the political order itself. Unlike other areas of law, these separation of powers disputes very often do not involve the application of clear rules. So in cases dealing with separated powers, judicial resolutions are only part of the ongoing dialogue among branches of government. Typically, resolutions of these kinds of hard cases are provided by other political actors, and Justice Jackson was alert to this. His concurring opinion in Youngstown Sheeton 2 versus Sawyer, you knew it was coming tonight, I imagine, right, demonstrates that he was alert to this. Recall in that case, the court struck as unconstitutional President Truman's actions to seize the national steel industry during the Korean War. Jackson wrote in concurrence, quote, "A judge may be surprised at the poverty of really useful and unambiguous authority applicable to concrete problems of executive power as they actually present themselves." In the same concurring opinion, Jackson reveals the importance of understanding the political as opposed to the strictly legal nature of executive power. He writes, No appraisal of the president's necessities is realistic, which overlooks that he heads a political system as well as a legal system. Party loyalties and interests, sometimes more binding than law, extend his effective control into branches of government other than his own. And he often may win, as a political leader, what he cannot command under the Constitution. So once we come to understand that constitutionalism and the rule of law are political concepts as much as legal ideals, we can begin to see how, at different times over our nation's history, executive power has been broadened, has been constrained, has been justified, even as the text of the Constitution itself hasn't changed. So our exploration of presidential power then begins with this rather simple but important principle that law and politics are deeply connected. The meaning, the context, and the consequence of executive actions, for example, are understood in light of what the political system permits, even if those actions appear to have no textual basis in the Constitution itself. So when we speak about the constitutionality of an action, by this logic, we are really referring to the action's propriety as a part of a constitutional system or order, rather than its consistency with the actual text of the Constitution. Take, for instance, Lincoln's actions during the Civil War, FDR's internment of the Japanese during World War II, Truman during the Korean War, Nixon during Vietnam and Watergate era, and Bush and Obama facing the threat of international terrorism. The powers taken by presidents in times of grave crisis often don't have clear constitutional or statutory authority. In fact, they may be based upon some inherent claim to presidential power. And as presidents make such claims, as they push the boundaries of the vagaries of Article 2 and take actions that exceed those boundaries, how the constitutional order responds is important for future expressions of presidential power. In this respect, we can understand the emergency actions taken by Presidents Trump and Obama, for example, as deriving from precedents set by prior exchanges, and thereby expressions of the accumulation of power rather than aberrant exercises of power. The evolutive quality of this dynamic is illustrated, of course, by Justice Jackson in his famous dissent in the Korematsu case in 1944. And many of you, of course, know this case. In Jackson's dissent, he rejects both the clear racism of the internment order that FDR ordered, but also the danger that judicial approval of such an action would portend. Jackson writes, "Much is said of the danger to liberty from the Army program for deporting and detaining these citizens of Japanese extraction. But a judicial construction of the Due Process Clause that will sustain this order is a far more subtle blow to liberty than the promulgation of the order itself. A military order, however unconstitutional, is not apt to last longer than the military emergency. But once a judicial opinion rationalizes such an order to show that it conforms to the Constitution, or rather rationalizes the Constitution to show that the Constitution sanctions such an order, the court for all time has validated the principle. The principle then lies about like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of an urgent need. Every repetition embeds that principle more deeply in our law and thinking and expands it to new purposes. A military commander may overstep the bounds of constitutionality, and it is an incident. But if we review and approve, that passing incident becomes the doctrine of the Constitution. There, it has a generative power of its own, and all that it creates will be in its own image." Jackson's concerns, of course, have been prescient. There has been a generative power to the discrete exercise of presidential emergency powers. The actions of presidents taken under the plausible claim of urgent need, and their subsequent validation and repetition have generated an accumulation of an expansive set of emergency powers available to contemporary presidents. If, in claiming prerogative or emergency power at a time of urgent need, presidential actions are validated by the constitutional order, there may be no meaningful limit to executive prerogative. That is not to say that emergency powers taken by presidents have not generated reaction from other actors. They have. Truman's actions during the Korean War, of course, Nixon, Johnson's actions in Vietnam, Bush's detainee policies were each challenged and in some cases limited in important respects. So the president's ability to take particular action is conditioned by the willingness and ability of Congress and the courts to constrain the president. If Congress lacks the incentive or the capacity to restrain executives, or if courts refuse to impose those constraints or are unable to enforce their rulings, the unlimited emergency powers of a president can pose dramatic challenges to a system of limited government under the rule of law. On this point, another passage from Jackson, Youngstown Sheet and Tube concurrence is instructive. He writes, "The actual art of governing under our Constitution does not and cannot conform to judicial definitions of the power of any of its branches based on isolated clauses or even single articles torn from context. It enjoins upon its branches separateness but interdependence, autonomy but reciprocity. Presidential powers are not fixed but fluctuate depending upon their disjunction or conjunction with those of Congress." Presidential power, Jackson's suggesting, is shaped by events, shaped by circumstance, shaped by political context and institutional resistance and contestation over constitutional authority and the constitutional order that those conditions create. Jackson's insistence that we understand presidential power as interdependent and reciprocal in a system of separated powers is key to understanding contemporary events as well. Some of the emergency powers that presidents have claimed, Lincoln again during the Civil War, or Wilson and Roosevelt during World Wars I and II, for example, were taken, some of them taken in the absence of congressional authorizations or constitutional authority. But there was a finite end to those measures. The Appomattox Courthouse, the Treaty of Versailles, VJ Day marked the cessation of hostilities against identifiable, uniformed adversaries on traditional battlefields. The extraordinary actions the presidents took to meet the challenges of those conflicts ebbed as those conflicts were resolved. But the terror attacks of September 11th presented new challenges to national security that were distinct from previous military conflicts. Then that national security emergency cut across policy areas and institutional structures. No longer was the military the principal institution defending the homeland. Now immigration officers, the FBI, police, Treasury Department, and others outside the Department of Defense were actively combating the threat. The president's role as commander-in-chief then expanded to accommodate that shift, that new paradigm, the new normal. And as a result, the new context changed the political dynamic of separate institutions sharing power. In the view of President George W. Bush, he was the decider. The other branches either did not have the jurisdictional authority to interfere with his actions, or had simply granted him the power to act unilaterally to face the crisis posed by terrorism. This permanent emergency condition gave rise to a new conception of presidential power, what has come to be known as the unitary executive theory. This view of unfettered presidential power is based on a reading of Article 2, Section 1, as an exclusive grant of broad unilateral powers to the president. By this broad reading, the president has complete, exclusive executive authority. It refers to the executive power, not some executive power, the referent is all power to execute the law. It is exclusive to the president as a single unitary actor. Congress, insofar as it would interfere in the execution of law, would be encroaching on the president's unilateral, unfettered executive authority. This view proposes that the president is permitted to, and even has the obligation to, act unilaterally, or perhaps even against congressional or constitutional authorization if the emergency poses a grave threat to national security, for instance. When there is a critical moment of national crisis or disaster, that's the title of my book, an insurrection or a terrorist attack perhaps, the public demand for swift, effective, and extra-legal executive action is high, and political constraints on executive power are low. However, as Attorney General Barr has argued, and many in the president's orbit have long pressed, the president has unitary executive powers independent of the circumstances. There does not need to be a national security crisis. There does not need to be an emergency in order to justify the plenary authority of the president to execute law. Unitary authority, they argue, is not situational. The president has the executive power at all times and always insulated from congressional or judicial encroachment. It's simply up to the president whether or not to exercise that latent authority in any particular situation. In practice, this means that a president can ignore or set aside laws passed by Congress. Similarly, the president may disregard court decisions that impermissibly interfere with or incorrectly define executive power. A president might have the view that, quote, their primary duty is to take care that the nation be preserved, to which the duty to take care that the laws, including the Constitution, be faithfully executed is subordinated. That was the view embraced by President Bush and his advisors after 9/11. It's also the view currently shared by William Barr, Justices Thomas and Alito, and many others. I can't imagine that Trump is aware of the theoretical framework within which he's working. But Attorney General Barr and White House counsel certainly are. Aided by Barr and White House counsel Pat Cipollone, President Trump, in fact, has extended unitary executive theory beyond the context of national security or national emergencies to include run-of-the-mill domestic affairs. In exercising its ordinary oversight function, Congress can make requests for, even subpoena documents and testimony. But under the unitary executive theory, the president has no obligation to comply, as Congress is unconstitutionally encroaching on executive authorities. And even when the stakes are elevated, when Congress clearly has legitimate investigatory interests at stake, such as during the impeachment inquiry, Trump dismissed congressional subpoenas for documents and testimony. And with his acquittal in the Senate, the president's, and not just this president, but any future president's, ability to resist congressional oversight will be dramatically expanded. But ultimately, it's a question of how sticky this new normal is. Those who wanted the president to provide documents and testimony from advisors simply didn't have the votes to compel his compliance. That is, non-compliance could have been made politically untenable for the president, as was seen in Watergate, for example. Senator Christopher Murphy, Democrat of Connecticut, was not so sanguine. He said after the acquittal, quote, "I don't know why a president would ever honor a subpoena after this." And without a subpoena power, of course, oversight is limited. The key point, though, is this, I think. This most recent shift toward a view of the unitary executive at all times, and not just in the context of national emergencies, that's insulated from the imposition of congressional or judicial constraints, suggests that a robust unilateralism was there all along. Certain presidents simply felt more constrained than others to put the full scope of the powers of their office to use. It's perhaps relevant then to ask what has changed that has unleashed a power that was always there, that had been bridled by almost every other president. And I think at least one answer, obviously, is that the political order now permits it. So a key feature of the unitary executive is presidential unilateralism. As we said before, right, the president's ability to make law on his own. But these are distinct ideas. The unitary executive refers to an approach to executive power generally, is the sole organ of implementing policy. Unilateralism, though, refers to the means of exercising that power, acting alone in the making of policy. So it's important that to recognize that one can exercise power unilaterally without explicitly embracing unitary executive theory. In fact, most every president has taken unilateral actions without couching those actions under the unitary executive umbrella. The challenges facing constitutionalism and the rule of law, I'd suggest, emerged from the unitary executive approach and not the particular mechanism of unilateralism. So the tension between the energy and the dispatch in the presidency and democratic accountability is most keenly felt, I think, not when presidents issue executive orders or issue signing statements, but when they refuse subpoenas, when they impound funds or wage unilateral war. This is roughly the difference between policy-level challenges, particular expressions of political preferences, and regime-level challenges, challenges to the political order itself. Unilateralism, as I said earlier, is a defining feature of modern presidential power, and it's pretty ordinary in that respect. All presidents are unilateral at times. And the conditions under which presidents pursue unilateral strategies are important to understand, especially if one's a member of Congress. Unilateral actions that might pursue extra-constitutional ends, however, and are, by the logic of the unitary executive, beyond review by courts or by Congress, that's what poses a fundamental challenge to constitutionalism itself. So as you all know, we're in a moment of great heightened, I should say, polarization. That's not new to us. But what that means is that major legislative action will require supermajorities rather than simple majorities. And as a consequence then, what that means is that congressional inaction on any particular policy is quite high. Right? The likelihood of congressional inaction is quite high on any particular policy. And the likelihood of congressional reaction to presidential unilateralism is quite low. So ideological polarization in Congress, then, invites presidents to extend executive power through unilateralism, including, for example, issuing executive orders, rather than bargaining and accommodating and finding compromise solutions to policy disputes. Indeed, recent actions by the Obama and Trump administrations reveal the incentives that presidents have for unilateralism, especially in the face of congressional resistance or inaction. The president's proclivity for the swift efficiency of unilateralism, however, can have important limitations. The scope of the president's ability to make significant, lasting changes under a particular statute might be rather limited. Ultimately, legislation like the Affordable Care Act or Dodd-Frank cannot simply be remade by presidential unilateral actions. Rather, Congress must vote to repeal or redesign those measures significantly. The regulations established pursuant to statutes were promulgated under the Administrative Procedures Act and have the full force of law and cannot be unilaterally removed. Courts also have a role to play in limiting unilateralism, as we observed in the case of the travel ban, for example. Nonetheless, as bargaining with Congress becomes less likely to achieve the policy results that presidents want, as Congress becomes more beleaguered by bicameralism and polarization, such that any coordinated reaction to unilateralism is impeded, presidents have further incentives to go it alone. So we might be inclined to consider then how Congress could assert more control over unilateralism. And recall the premise with which I began, that our constitutional order is made within politics. If constitutionalism is understood as constrained and maintained within politics, then the character of our politics has implications for our constitutional order, and by extension then, Congress's willingness to constrain executive overreach. Polarization in Congress incentivizes presidents to act unilaterally, which is something, though, that should concern people of both parties, because it reveals the difficulties that inhere in constraining executive prerogative even when majorities in Congress are inclined to do so. The absence of congressional constraint then becomes the tacit approval of presidential power. So the polarized character of our politics limits our constitutional order. Or more precisely, it expands the set of possible unilateral actions that are impervious to constraints. One of the key challenges we face then is to find ways to invigorate congressional resilience in the face of presidential unilateralism. So let's turn, this is the fun part, right? Let's turn to how we might do that. Remember, right, the Constitution binds political actors, including presidents, to a set of constraints that we generally understand to comprise the rule of law. A constitutional system then takes certain things off the table. Targeting religious or ethnic minorities, defying lawful subpoenas, waging unilateral war, as I said, are beyond the constitutional powers of a president. But those constraints are only as effective as other political actors are willing to impose them. All presidents have the incentive to press against the vague boundaries of Article II powers to their advantage, and many, particularly in the modern era, do so. What remains off the table for those presidents, then, is conditioned by the willingness of political actors to impose the constraints. In the aftermath of Watergate, presidential historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. noted that the Nixon presidency was a culmination, not an aberration. The seeds of the extra-constitutional actions taken by the president that were ultimately exposed in the Watergate scandal, and the crisis in confidence of the institutions of government that resulted were sown long before 1972. Those seeds were nurtured, Schlesinger says, by an enfeebled Congress and considerably debilitated constitutional constraints on the president. Executive actions that push the boundaries of the Constitution or violate statutes are judged not simply in terms of the text of the Constitution or the text of the statute, but in terms of what the political order will permit in light of the law and the political context. As Schlesinger noted, quote, the great institutions, Congress, the courts, the executive agencies, the press, the universities, public opinion, have to reclaim their own dignity and meet their own responsibilities to assert constitutional limits on the executive. That's 1973. Just how those great institutions have responded in moments of crisis has varied. At times, Congress has appeared to overcome its lassitude by actively overseeing executive agencies, passing statutes, Pendleton Act, Hatch Act, Budget Impoundment Control Act, War Powers Act, a number of others, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, that seek to rein in executive power. At other times, Congress simply ignored presidential abuses or potential abuses or extra-legal actions, or as we saw most recently, was unable to overcome bicameralism and political differences to assert its authority to police the boundaries of executive power. Still other Congresses have even explicitly authorized the president to take such actions after the fact. Courts, for their part, tend to take a back seat. preferring for Congress to provide the necessary oversight, budgetary control, statutory constraint, or other means of limiting the executive. Though here too there are exceptions. Youngstown Sheet and Tube for one. During the Nixon administration, for example, the federal courts rejected the president's claim of executive privilege, as you perhaps know, and directed the White House to produce the tapes that ultimately confirmed the president had approved the Watergate cover-up, an action that then precipitated their resignation. And as we saw in the Ukraine revelations, even within an administration, there are examples of agency and White House staffers who balance their career and professional obligations against the principles they value. In addition, internal constraints are at work in the executive branch. Inspectors General, Office of Government Ethics, the GAO, the Governmental Accountability Office, the Office of Personnel Management, and many others, play a role in constraining executive power as well. The press, of course, plays the watchdog role. The biggest political scandals of the modern era were brought to light by good reporting on key elements of that scandal. Watergate, of course, but also Iran-Contra, which began as the press followed a lead about the downing of a cargo plane in Nicaragua. And of course, there's civil society. Non-governmental organizations, colleges, universities, individual citizens, interest groups have all played a part in constraining executive power. Student protesters during the Vietnam War, the widespread and rapid reaction by thousands of protesters upon the Trump administration's declaration of the so-called Muslim travel ban, the bonus army marches, and many other examples of citizens taking action to confront what they perceive to be misconduct by an administration. As the protectors of the constitutional order, the press, the public, Congress, bureaucracy, and the courts have all been key players. And at times, the particular event, like Watergate, was a crucible for significant institutional change. At other times, the events were considered aberrational and thus not implicating policy. But often, the political context is such that even when many in those great institutions seek to impose statutory or constitutional limits on presidential power, their efforts are stymied. In many instances, it appears that the more powerful the legal constraints sought to be imposed upon the presidency, the more difficult it is to achieve politically. But maybe there are mechanisms that can shift the balance, even if only a bit. We might think about oversight functions of Congress as perhaps a bit more debilitated than it needs to be. Informational investigatory hearings with the full force of subpoena power and contempt proceedings. Budgetary authority, power of the purse, provides leverage then, perhaps, for information that would otherwise not be given to Congress to serve their oversight functions. And of course, there could be another round of impeachment. But in order for Congress to act, in order for Congress to overcome, as I said before, its lassitude, the incentives for Congress must be individualized to members of Congress. Congress, as political scientists often say, and my students are sick of hearing it, Congress is a they, not an it. There are multiple members of Congress, each with their own independent incentives that has bearing on what they do collectively. But a collective appeal for members of Congress to do something that's in the interest of Congress as a whole isn't going to go very far unless there's an individualized incentive to take that action. And so there's very little reason any individual member of Congress has to take the bullet for the whole chamber. So I invite you, and this is a bit, perhaps not as exciting as you might have imagined the finish could be, but I invite you to think through how that might be done. How do we individualize individual members of Congress? And I give you a hint, there's probably an electoral connection. But I want to thank you all. I know I've talked a long time, but I really, I think it's obviously it's important and timely But I do find great joy that there are some of you who find it of use to hear about this, and I encourage you to approach me afterwards or ask a question now if you have, or even give a comment if you have some reflections on this topic. So thank you all very much.
I did tell your students they get extra credit if they're able to stump.
No such thing.
Any questions, comments?
Yes. In your opinion, why didn't the Democrats go to court to enforce several of their subpoenas?
Why did they not?
They did not.
Well, I would assume, I would take Schiff at his word that that would take too long. They would go to court, ultimately the court would rule, and the person might come before them and then claim executive privilege in a particular context, and then they'd be back in court again, all the while elections happened and the president presumably would do what he said he was going to do with respect to that election.
In your opinion, would the court feel if it processed very quickly, would have enforced this?
Yeah, and if had that happened, I think there still would have been a claim of executive privilege, even if the court had acted quickly. And then the court presumably could have ruled on the executive privilege claim, but again, and then they could have come in and then not, the timing of it probably would not be sufficient if it had anything done before the election, my guess.
The Uniform Code of Military Justice, UCMJ, is designed to eliminate command influence in the military justice system. What is your view on a president, any president, meddling in the military justice system, either by pardoning somebody convicted under the UCMJ or asking the military to go after somebody that the military has no reason to go after?
I have a dim view of that, as you might imagine. But again, what would be, and I'll ask you, I don't know how this operates. What would be the mechanism by which the president would be constrained from doing that?
Well,
I would assume it would be Congress.
It would be the military NCOs and officers using the military justice system as a disciplinary measure and not as a justice system. And the president, of course, is higher than all the military officers, so it's still command influence if you meddle in the military justice system, which is essentially a fair system.
Yeah. Again, my guess is it's up to Congress to constrain that, to take action to prevent that from happening, but they're not going to do that. I don't have a really thoughtful response other than that it's really up to Congress to make that decision.
We have a Navy JAG lawyer here.
Yeah, well, good. Somebody please help me. Where's the Navy JAG lawyer? Oh, Jim? Is that right? Hi.
I have a partial solution. How many of you have accepted the fact that whether you like it or not, you're here because of an immigrant? And if it weren't for the immigrants who had the nerve to come to this country knowing no one, having nobody to help them, and they were working 20-hour days. I know they were because I have come from there. And my parents always talked about why they came here, and my mother never wanted to go back, and she would say, I'm living in paradise, why will I go back? How many of you think that you're living in paradise? How many of you care about it? How many sit there and tell your children, do you realize what you have here, what you can do? The young today don't even know why they're here. They don't care why they're here. And they don't care whom they elect. And our biggest problem is we do not make any demands on the people that are elected to represent us. And what a lot of you who represent us don't, because once I vote for you, doesn't matter if I'm a Republican or a Democrat, you are responsible to listen to what I have to say to you. And how many of you listen? You don't even listen to people who really know what they're talking about. I know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about me and my children and how I've raised them. And it's very important to be able to say, I'm an American. And it's not bad to say, my background, I was Greek. And I'm proud of being Greek, because I'm not proud of what we represent. We send these people to Washington, and they're chicken all, because all they're interested in is getting elected and living off the fat of the land, and we're paying for them to do what they're doing, which is nothing. Having said that, it goes all the way down to our own people in our own little niche. You have to believe, and you have to hold your head up and remember that the people who came here, that's why you're here. Not because you were so great, it's because they had the nerve. They were working 20-hour days. How many of you work 20 hours? How many of you were even working an 8-hour day? Having said that,
Thank you.
I will be quiet.
Can I ask you a context question for the unitary presidency that you're talking about? Can you give us some sense of comparison? I'll throw out 3 examples, but if you have better examples, by all means, you use them to put it in context. But I'm trying to pick 3 things that were roundly criticized during the president's administration. So the first example would be President Lincoln and the suspension of habeas corpus, roundly criticized. Let's take then let's fast forward to the current, which is where you're saying the unitary theory is emerging. Let's take President Obama and his use of the IRS to investigate what he regarded as potentially political opponents, and then President Trump's example that you cited with respect to the subpoenas. Is there one that's more egregious, or are they all equally bad? And then the second part of the question would be this: isn't there a pathway to resolve those in each instance? The Congress ratified Lincoln's suspension, and they could have gone to court to test Trump's subpoenas. They weren't. How do we know that they were lawful until that is tested? And so I guess it's a 2-part question: context and how, aren't there some realistic limits?
Yeah. Really interesting question. Complex. So let me start by saying that Lincoln did not have the language of the unitary executive, but the action that was taken was based upon an inherent power that he claimed, right? To face the emergency. So the suspension of habeas corpus comes at a time when he's facing insurrection, and Congress then afterwards gives him the authority to have done so. The question was whether he could have done that when there isn't an authority given to the president to suspend habeas corpus. That's a power given to Congress. So the question is whether the president violated the Constitution in order to save the country. And his response was, yeah, right? Yes. What is the point of the Constitution but to serve the interests of the country? And that was part of the logic. But he was very sensitive, and I'm coming around to the other parts of the question, but he was very sensitive that this was specific to this moment. This was not a view of presidential power generally that he shared. He was of an era of a literalist presidency, that is a limited presidency. And when he took this action that was essentially violating the Constitution in order to save the Constitution, to save the country, he understood it for what it was and bracketed it as necessary to meet the emergency situation. And I don't remember, forgive me, but it was something like, are we to uphold the Constitution but lose the country, right, was the often quoted remark. And you can get the sense that in emergency, the president sometimes, this is Lockean prerogative, the president sometimes has to take actions that are either in violation of the Constitution or where the Constitution is silent, the president must take those actions to meet the emergency. Investigating political opponents, in the case of the Obama, using the IRS to do this, right, it's not the same, it's not a national emergency. Right? That's a political vendetta of some kind. There's something else at foot there. There isn't the same kind of crisis that extra constitutional or extra statutory authority can be taken. drone strikes on civilians, right? So another thing that could have been part of the examples given might be more akin to that crisis because this is a moment of perpetual crisis, right? That we have, global, as Bush called it, a global war on terror that is perpetual, never ending, against non-state actors that aren't in uniforms, quite different than World War I or World War II or something else. And so the well of powers from which presidents can draw in those moments of crisis and emergencies like an ongoing war on terror are quite substantial and akin to those powers that Lincoln might be able to draw on. The difference then, moving forward from that, is thinking about executive power outside of those moments of crisis. And when a president in a moment of crisis can take an action that is in some respects perhaps defensible in light of that crisis, that same action certainly wouldn't be defensible outside of that crisis. It's outside of that context. But the unitary executive theory presumes that even if the president takes that action, it's not reviewable by courts. Congress cannot investigate that. And the mechanism by which they fight that investigation, of course, is to ignore the subpoenas. And then Congress then is forced to go to get civil contempt, go to civil court for contempt, and then rely on some judge to enforce that contempt of court. I don't know if I answered your question, but I guess the context matters, and the judgment that the president makes that this is, I have this authority by virtue of the crisis or by virtue of the unitary executive power that I have, my view of Article 2. And that's different. Obama never made the claim, I have the authority to do this because my view of Article 2. I think he just did it thinking that I just used the weapons of the federal government against my political opponent.
Andrew Jackson, when he evicted the chair police from North Carolina to Oklahoma, the Supreme Court ruled, you have no power to do that. And I guess he quipped and says, I didn't know the Supreme Court had an army. And that's where it lay.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and that's part of the reason I made the point about the limitations that courts face in resolving separation of powers disputes.
So I became a U.S. citizen in 2015. I didn't grow up in this country. From my perspective of how things are set up here is that the founding fathers had a very clear idea of not letting the power in the hands of one person. They were very, very worried about that because of their experience with England and the king. So they came here and said, we're going to start new and we're going to separate and create 3 branches. And these branches will work together, but they will also have checks and balances. My impression is from the past few years that there is a lot of murkiness going on, and it's less clear how these 3 branches are separated and which one has what power over the other, or how can control the other. And another impression I get is that because the presidents for the past 20 years use so much executive orders, people get confused and they think presidents creates law, which is not true. The government, not the government, the Congress creates the law. What presidents does through executive order, they influence the federal government. The problem is that the federal government has a lot of influence in our lives. They provide states with grants, with money, for healthcare, for school. So when a president signs an order that says, okay, I'm not going to give, the federal government will not give loans for students to be able to go to school, it's going to influence a lot of us. And I think that creates a difficult situation and a lot of murkiness, so to speak. I don't think the president should have so much power to decide in this kind of things. His power should be more executive, which is like overseeing, making sure the laws are applied correctly and not get involved in all these little specific things that affect us as population so much. And that's what I think the problem is a lot, but I'm not an expert. You are, but that's my opinion. If you have something to say.
No, I enjoyed listening. I think you're quite right. I think that's impressive that in the short time you've been here that you have that perspective on what's happening in the federal government.
One last question. Yes.
Hi.
After FDR and presidential term limits were enacted, did they consider term limits at the time for Congress? And part two, do you ever see a time when there can be such a thing?
So I don't know the history of that. Maybe somebody else would know the history. I know in the early 90s there was a push for term limits for Congress, but I don't know about the time of the term limiting the president, whether there's a similar discussion for Congress. Somebody else perhaps does know that story. I don't. Yeah.
Congress makes the law, they decide nobody can
Yeah.
term limit us. So
Right.
that's-
No. Right. Yeah. But I didn't know if there was a buzz about perhaps term
it was
limiting members of
never
Congress.
a thing.
So political science doesn't know a lot, but one of the things we know is that term limits can be a really bad idea. And
Stay in the power of the presidency or limit it?
well, again, political science doesn't know a lot. So the person I cited earlier in the talk about unilateralism being the definitional characteristic of a modern presidency, that guy is arguing, and it's a good thing. And I mean, his whole book is about, his name's Will Howell, and Terry Moe and Will Howell have written a lot about presidential unilateralism. And their argument is, and we need more of it, because that's the only way stuff gets done. Because, and there's actually the first page of my book, I cite them because they have a great line, is there are no legislators on Mount Rushmore. And there never will be. Legislators are beset by parochial interests, particular constituencies. They are not reflective of the common good or the public good or even the national interest. Presidents, however, are, and we ought to endow them with the authority that's commensurate to the claim they make upon this country. And so we need more unilateral powers. We need less murkiness. We need more presidential power.
I don't
Would-
agree with that.
No, I know. I didn't think you would. I didn't think you would. But that's the argument they're making. And in some respects, it's an argument from technocratic expertise. I mean, they're not thinking about one individual needs to have all this, but they're saying the executive branch with all of the authority that knows how things run, right? That we have really capable public servants, and many of them are probably in this room, that help government run. Congress only gets in the way. Yeah.
Good job.
Please join me in thanking Dr.
Yeah,
Harward.
that's not my argument.
Thank you all. I can see it has started snowing a little bit, so please be careful on your way home. Thank you all so very much for joining us tonight.
Kristen?